we choose the narrative that we tell about our history and our future. And so what the pandemic had done is to have us think about that narrative of origin and therefore the narrative of future. You know, what do we think about where we're at, where we come from, and how these things play into one another?
It's about knowing and understanding that our indigenous knowledge is actually a system of knowledge that is deeply ingrained in our cultures, across a variety of cultures in South Africa. And it comes with deep-seated competencies and wisdoms about nature, about ways of living, ways of being.
That our system is riven with deep inequalities. The inequalities are between the institutions, inequalities are between the students, between the staff, and it became clear to us that, that there wasn't going to be an easy route, to addressing the challenge of the pandemic. So we had to create partnerships, that we had to get our universities to work together in concert, to share resources, to share information, to work together in developing solutions to the big challenges we are facing.
A big question going forward is how important is it still to have a formal degree of 3 or 4 or 5 years? What about micro-credentialing? What about the fact that you learn on the go? The person who engages with students in smaller, intensive learning environments and teaches them to think critically, to know how to analyze problems. Those are the kind of issues that we're going to need, and qualities that we're going to need to instill in our students.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ryan Fortune. I'm your host for the second episode of the Cornerstone Critical Dialogues on Bush Radio 89.5 FM. I'm very pleased to be with you once again. This is a new partnership between Bush Radio and the Cornerstone Institute of Higher Learning in Cape Town. This evening, we're going to be taking an in-depth look, a deep dive into the issue of higher learning, the state of higher learning in South Africa and the world right now. We understand that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused huge disruptions to many aspects of society, but none more so perhaps than the higher learning space, where universities and colleges have been hugely disrupted and have had to adapt their methods, their methodologies, their processes to the new reality of a global pandemic. In the studio with me this evening, I'll be having an esteemed panel of guests, and I'll be assisted with this conversation by Dr. Rudi Bays, who is in the studio with me right now. I'm going to be talking to him initially, and we're going to then be going to our guests. Dr. Rudi Bays is the Executive Dean at the Cornerstone Institute. He has been there since 2017, and he has studied abroad. His prior roles include the Dean of Student Affairs at Free State University, the Provincial Youth Commissioner tasked with education 2005 to 2009, and the spokesperson of the Provincial Education Ministry. Rudi specializes in public theology with a focus on community engagement in particular. And he's with me in the studio. We're going to be crossing later on in the show. We're going to be calling in Professor Ahmed Bawa, amongst others. He is the CEO of USAF, which is University South Africa, which oversees 26 universities in South Africa. He's going to be on the line with us very soon. Rudi, good evening. How are you?
Hey, Ryan. I'm doing well, and yourself?
I'm very good. How do you feel?
It's brilliant to be with you and to be at Bush Radio. I mean, it's such a historical place to be at, so it's wonderful to be here. It's a great partnership.
So tell me, Rudi, from your perspective, what is the journey that Cornerstone Institute has been on over the last 2 years? How has the pandemic and all its complications affected Cornerstone before we get to the meat of the conversation?
I think that's a great question that all institutions actually have to really ask themselves. I mean, one of the key things in a higher education institution is that when you open the web page, if you will, its web page, most likely under the About sort of tab, you will find a description of its history, and then there would be sort of almost a typical type of thing of a narrative of origin. Where does this institution come from? And what institutions do, as much as we would do as individuals or so, is we choose the narrative that we tell about our history and our future. And so what the pandemic had done, with Cornerstone, as much as with any other institution, as much as for society at large, is to have us think about that narrative of origin and therefore the narrative of future. What do we think about where we're at, where we come from, and how these things play into one another? Well, as a general point, So what happened at Cornerstone, I think, is not unique. But what did happen is that we had to really reflect on, at least in the space of learning, how are we becoming different as human beings due to something as major as a global pandemic? How do people think different? How do societies have to change the way we work? And therefore, what new types of, or, adjusted, if you will, knowledge projects we need to undertake or sort of, work with.
So really,
so what we teach and what we learn needs to shift. But that you can't do that without thinking around who you are, who you want to be, where you come from, and where you want to go.
So a real deep period of self-reflection.
And the thing is, there's no point where you sit around a sort of a table and says, all right, we now need to deal with these questions. Inevitably, to the experiences of students and staff and in the research project and so, the questions come up. But something shifted. How do we make sense of that? And that raises the question. Of course, this is higher education. You have to. It's about the questions all the time. But it's been a very positive experience, broadly speaking, in terms of rethinking what it means to be a knowledge-based institution that works with knowledge and learning and so. So tough. Due to what people and our people, meaning students and lecturers and so forth, live through during this time, but also revitalizing in the sense of having to rethink questions and focus, So I think tonight's discussion, we're really talking to sort of high-profile thinkers in the sector, will also help us to understand how to think in the sector and also for all of us around the sector that interacts. To see what will be the key questions that we should be asking, and maybe we have some answers also coming up.
Yes. I'm in the studio here with Dr. Reverend Rudi Bays, who is the Executive Dean at Cornerstone Institute, and we are talking this evening about the state of higher learning in South Africa today and broadly in the world as well. This is a very critical area of discussion. And we are joined on the line by Professor Ahmed Bawa. Dr. Bawa, are you there, Professor?
I am.
Oh, there we are. Thank you so much. Professor Bawa, lots of things happening in the sector. I believe USAF recently hosted a big conference in Johannesburg, in Pretoria. Can you tell us a bit about that? What was the topic and the theme, and maybe that can lead on to the rest of the discussion?
Professor, could I also ask, Ryan, if you could maybe just give some background around USAF as well for our listeners who might not be aware of the organization and its role within the sector.
Sure. Thank you so much. And first of all, let me just thank you, Ryan, for inviting me onto the program. I really appreciate it. So let me begin with a little kind of definition of what USAF is. So USAF is Universities South Africa. It's an umbrella body of the 26 public universities. It's set up by the universities and basically works on 3 or 4 very broad themes. The one is it works on policy, so it writes policy and it kind of responds to policy that come from government and from other sources. Secondly, it does a certain amount of advocacy work, but I suppose its main work is really to build the capacity of the universities to perform their functions in the most effective way. So it has a number of strategy groups and communities of practice. And of course, the board is made up of the vice chancellor, so that connects the leadership with the rank and file, if you like, of the sector. And then finally, it has a set of kind of more directed programs. One is on higher education leadership development. It builds kind of it builds a pipeline, if you like, for new leadership to emerge. And that's a very deliberately designed program. And then it has, for the last 3 or 4 years, it has led the entrepreneurship development in higher education program, which was initially set up by the Department of Higher Education Training, which is now with us. So those are the kind of core functions, if you like. And now to turn to the conference, it's the second sort of higher education conference that USAF has convened, and this one was held in partnership with the Council on Higher Education. And the theme was the university as an engaged institution, or it's the engaged university. And it really arose out of the kind of, this enormous stress test, that was applied on the universities through 2015 to 2017 with the Fees But Small and Rose But Small campaigns, and then with COVID-19, right? And the key question that kept arising, during this period of stress, if you like, was just a recognition as to how dislocated the university system was from public ownership, if you like. These are public universities, and the big question that kept, arising was, why is the public ownership of the university system so weak? And that's something that we thought needed to be addressed in a very kind of forthright and honest way, if you like. And that became the theme of the conference, and it was built around a series of interesting dialogues and conversations and presentations, which were largely designed by the 5 key strategy groups that we had. So that was the general theme, the engaged university.
So, Professor, thank you very much for that. I was one of your, participants at the conference,
Great.
and it was at least as a second conference, but overall it was really, really a significant engagement. I think the types of questions, the type of speakers, facilitators, and so I really encourage listeners, in actual fact, to just go to the USAF website and just download the program. You'll just get an idea of who's the who's who, if you will, in the scholarship of higher education. So thanks for outlining that, Professor. Of course, in a sense, it's just par for the course to talk about the impact of the pandemic. Did you sort of find, or to what extent did you find that even if one would ask questions of, how universities relate to an unequal society, how we sort of relate in the sector to the broader transformation of society, whether there was a shift in the types of questions or themes that had come forward or had been foregrounded due to the pandemic. And I don't mean simply what would be the teaching and learning technicalities, but what's the sort of fundamental questions that would be on the table? Did the pandemic really shift the reflection on these core questions of higher education?
Yeah. So I would kind of point out to 4 things I think that arose, in particular in 2020. We were very, on the one hand, we felt extremely concerned about saving the academic year. We thought that if we were not able to save the academic year, that the roll-on impact for students that were completing the National Senior Certificate exam this year would just be enormous. So that became a very central theme. But the moment we did that, the moment we made that kind of a driving impetus, if you like, what emerged almost immediately is that that our system is riven with deep inequalities. The inequalities are between the institutions, inequalities are between the students, between the staff, and And it became clear to us that, that there wasn't going to be an easy route, to addressing the challenge of the pandemic. So there were 3 or 4 things that emerged. The first one was just this notion that we had to be extremely careful that we didn't jeopardize students who were in difficult situations with regard to the kinds of interventions that universities were putting in place. So it was critically important that we adopted what we thought of as a social justice rubric, if you like, to kind of really try and ensure that students, every student had an opportunity, if you like, to have a fair go at completing the academic year. The second was just this realization that we had to create partnerships, that we had to get our universities to work together in concert, to share resources, to share information, to work together in developing solutions to the big challenges we are facing. Then there were partnerships, new kinds of partnerships with the government, the kinds of partnerships we had never, there's always a tension, between, the university sector and government. It's always about cuts in subsidy or cuts in student funding or, inroads into autonomy and things like that, But we thought we worked very hard at building kind of a cohesive partnership with government. We would not have been able to do it without that.
Right.
And the same was true with the Council on Higher Education, because all this shift to kind of to remote kind of emergency teaching and learning had huge implications for quality. So we had to bring in the Council on Higher Education. And then finally, I should just mention that we had to work closely with big business. We had to work with the mobile network operators to try and get them to come to the table and to try and get them to ensure that that data was available at a reduced rate, that that students had free access to university websites and so on. So that was the second major principle, I think. And then the third one was just a realization of how fragile our university system is, in terms of its long-term sustainability. The short-term financial crisis was enormous. Of course, some universities coped much better because they have deeper pockets and so on, much deeper pockets. But at the same time, what we also realized was that the impact of COVID-19 on the economy had severe implications for the long-term sustainability of the sector. So we are grappling with those challenges now.
I can't help but ask, Professor, thank you for that sort of outline. Ask about sort of what is, apart from, through clever partnerships, strengthening, if you will, the income streams from various sectors in society, from business and so to the sector. What then would be the partnerships or additional sort of options that's been, in discussion, if you will? To strengthen long-term sustainability. I mean, we won't be talking about sort of less public institutions. We won't talk about the next round of, universities being combined, different institutions. I mean, what's some of the ideas that's been flowing in the discussions?
So let me mention 3 things, because there are a number of them. But let me just mention 3 things. The one is just this idea that we should really work very hard at building, what we are calling a shared services platform. So just this idea that we should really be working to build teaching and learning platforms which are nationally managed, but which are accessible to all 26 universities, properly kind of segregated and so on, so that universities and students still had kind of the sense that they had their own platform, but actually they wouldn't have to invest in the platform, that we would do that at national level. So developing a kind of, what you might think of as a national teaching and learning platform, if you like, which includes access to data and everything else. So that's the one.
Professor,
the one.
Even if it was
idea.
only that idea, it's really, really exciting.
It is.
It
Yeah.
opens so many possibilities, even in the context of what we understand to be the fourth industrial revolution.
Exactly.
So, but sorry, I've interrupted you. Yeah.
Then, and of course, it doesn't have to be just the universities. It could also be then the TVT colleges, for example. And then you can broaden that, to other kinds of institutions. So that's the first thing. And of course, in that shared services platform, you can think about administrative systems. You can think about, universities coming together and pooling their resources in terms of software design and so on and so forth. So that's the one kind of idea. The second sort of major idea was the idea of, now that there's been so much of investment and so much of skills kind of developed in virtual teaching and learning, although we still have a long way to go. But just the idea that we can now start thinking about co-offering degrees, co-offering programs, that we could think about University of Limpopo and University of Johannesburg, sort of co-offering a program on whatever it could be. It could be, in particular, where we have a shortage of skills. Where we have a deficit of capacity, if you like, to teach. Right? So that kind of discussion can now take place. And the one discussion we're having with the Department of Higher Education and Training is the possibility of some funding that will be committed to this kind of partnership building. That's a very direct kind of input. Both of these, by the way, the shared service platform and this, could be one way of addressing the huge inequities in our system. And then third was just really getting our universities to understand that we can do much more by aggregating resources than not. So let me give you one example. I mean, at the moment, each university contributes to its journal subscriptions. Hugely expensive. We spend about 600 million rand a year on journal subscriptions. Now, the one thing we could do is we could aggregate those resources and strike a national deal with the publishers rather than have each institution kind of do that. And what that would do is then provide access to those journal holdings to the entire sector and to the broader community, if you like. So it's those kinds of ideas that are on the table at the moment.
Professor, I don't mean to be testy, but as sort of in often you find students or students who apply or who want to apply, reflecting on which institution is the best.
Yes.
Of course, that goes along with affordability and all those type of questions, and whether there's access to NSFAS or whatever other sort of scholarship there might be. But I want to go to the one that I think is best. In these proposals that's on the table, doesn't that sort of, risk, what would be one would consider sort of a healthy competition between institutions?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question, and I think the way to answer that would be to say that a university of let's just take the University of Johannesburg. The University of Johannesburg graduate, will by the University of Johannesburg be expected to have a certain layer of graduate attributes, if you like, and that has to be built into the program design. It has to be built into student experience. It has to be built into the way that the academics are geared for their teaching, for their teaching enterprises and so on. And each university, I think, has to focus on that. And I have to say, that I think we will all agree that the bulk of the learning that happens at universities doesn't happen in the classroom. It happens in what you might think of as the second curriculum, the stuff that happens outside the classrooms. So I think that producing a shared services platform and so on doesn't negate the capacity of universities to innovate and to sharpen their kind of commitments to building graduate attributes that they would see as being distinctive of that institution, if you like. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Professor. And I must say, as I said, I'm a bit tongue-in-cheek with that particular question, because each institution is really unique in terms of its location, in terms of its history, in terms of its sort of feeder communities, if you will. So as much as we have similar sort of purposes and goals, and so across the sector, there's unique sort of perspectives that come within each institution and the collectives and communities that's part of that institution or the broader institution. Then, but I really appreciate the fact that you raised graduate attributes as a key point. I'm not sure to what extent the notion of graduate attributes is sort of alive in the minds of families and communities when they think of entering higher education. I think it's worthwhile that you've referred to that and that we could just indicate and say, but or remind our listeners that there's been a shift, that the perspective on students joining institutions aren't simply any longer about the sort of piece of paper, the qualification, and even then the skills for your profession that you walk away with. It's really about who you are and who you've become as a citizen, as an individual, as a engaged part of the society, And that is often what we, refer to in brief, at least, when we say we're trying to build attributes for the graduates that leave the institution. And so the decision, to a large extent, is based on, or in a sense, our argument is in the sector should be based on looking at who will I become at this institution and therefore joining this institution. Now, the question is, did that change during this pandemic? And I think that underlies of much of what you've shared with us now. I would argue, Professor, and I'd like to ask your comment on it, and that is to say that the pandemic had such a fundamental impact on how we go about what we consider to be the normal business of higher education, that fundamentally our understanding of self had entered a new epoch, if you will, a new timeline in a sense, and we can't really step back from that. There's no normal to step back to, and I don't want to use the words new normal, but we're in a completely new space. So what would you say, to that perspective? Is there something to go back to? Is it something that we need to grab a hold of to say there's a whole new possibilities of designing new ways of engagement? I mean, apart from only sort of virtual learning and teaching, how could we think different about that? Now, what? And just to sort of close my question is, I really appreciate that you had drawn this rethink of education further than only the pandemic, but also, to the student movement's work over the past 5-6 years. I think that's a precise description of where the rethink actually started. But anyway, so how should we be thinking different of our place within society? What is in our future in the questions that we ask?
The one thing that's completely clear is that there isn't going to be a reversal to sort of the traditional face-to-face kind of lectures. But there will be a reverse. There will be a return to face-to-face engagement. I think what you're going to see at our university is a much more substantial use of technology in what you might think of as kind of mixed learning or blended learning, where students will be expected to engage materials, more effectively on devices via the web, and where the face-to-face engagements will really be intensive tutorials, much more kind of intensive learning, and very likely a small group engagements, if you like. So a return to much more intensive learning, it seems to me, and I think that that has the possibility of unleashing much more active learning, if you like, on the part of students. So that's, I think, the one, and I think most universities are now contemplating, what the new normal would look like, just in terms of the use of technology. So that's the one point. The second point is, I think, it's become patently clear, that we have to pay much more attention to the way in which universities design what I referred to earlier as a second curriculum. That just, ensuring that student experience on campuses, student engagement on campuses, their exposure to, the grand challenges facing our society through engagement with external parties and so on, that's going to become much more intensive, it seems to me, as we head into the future. And I think that it ties in, with the notion of decolonizing education. I mean, this idea of trying to ensure that the overall curriculum at our universities speak much more to the local context, if you like. When I say local context, I don't mean the local town or the local community, but I mean sort of a set of concentric circles. Starting with the communities around the campus and then going out from there. But understanding, in fact, that decolonization is not just simply about new texts and so on, but it is in fact about reconceptualizing the knowledge project vis-a-vis the local and the global, if you like. So I think that those are the ideas I think that are now kind of taking root at our universities. Now, I'm not suggesting that this doesn't have to do, that decolonization doesn't have to do with ensuring that that there's a transformation in the nature of our curricula and what goes on in the classrooms and making sure that there's epistemic access and so on. But I think that that's only a part of the story. I think it's a much bigger story than that.
Professor, your comments are, if you'll allow me, are music to my ears, if you will. Especially when you refer to the second curriculum, and we have to break. But you put out these extremely exciting ideas. Your reference to the second curriculum, I think, is worthwhile for our conversation to just also touch on as a particular matter. Referring to what is often also called the co-curriculum.
Yes.
And historically had then been sort of the out-of-class experience of, experiential curriculum and so forth. But the point being, everything that a student lives through outside the classroom and even within the classroom, which is not the formal teaching or the formal curriculum work, all of that represents learning material, if you will, to oversimplify it. And what that I know we've done in the sector of the past years, and I think, and I know while you were leading at DUT as Vice Chancellor, you had played a major role in building that program there as well.
Sure.
Is in the co-curriculum program to actually be intentional about what are the experience that students are engaged with, whether on their own, in residences or, at wherever it might be, that ties into our formal points of reflection. There's one curriculum I would like to add to that, Professor, and that is the notion of the hidden curriculum. And that's the things that our students, our colleagues learn in what they observe without realizing and not reflecting intentionally about those observations. What paintings are against the walls, what statues are on what campuses, if you will. And those type of things that the student movement had foregrounded for us over the past few years. So it's these three curriculums that play together. And it's such a worthwhile point to make because it shows that our universities engage much more than simply the technical curriculum to gain a particular qualification. But the question remains, how will the walls of the corridors of the campus building change? Now that we know all of this, and essentially, theoretically, the walls of our thinking had been opened. The borders had been pulled away or down, if you will, due to the pandemic. So I'm discussing it with you. But do you think it's possible in a more virtual world to really direct something like a second curriculum? I mean, aren't we sort of, being too hopeful about directing everything as we used to in the sector?
Yeah, look, the interesting thing about the co-curriculum, or the second curriculum, is just the fact that it has to be co-created, between the university and students. I think the university has to it has to design itself in such a way that second curriculum becomes a co-creation between the university and students. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, the transformation of the student body at DUT or at UKZN resulted in the complete decline of cricket, at those institutions, and the rise of rugby, at those institutions, simply because the student body had changed. Now, of course, there was a dogged attempt by those universities to actually keep the cricket fields, and they're really expensive to keep, and to ensure that the coaches were there and employed, and so on and so forth. But actually, the transformation in the student body just has its own dynamics, if you like, on the way in which that second curriculum is shaped. So it's this idea of saying, that universities also have to take a deep breath and understand how to design themselves around the needs and the challenges and the growth of their current students, not the students that used to come there,
Yeah, no, Professor, but you see, it's easier to shift to rugby these days because you have Sia as the captain and you win all over the place, and we struggle a little bit with our cricket teams, but, let's not comment on that now. Yeah. Professor, thank you very much. We have to take a break now, and we'll have to let you go for a moment, and we might pick up with you again later over the next hour and a half or so. But thank you very much for your frank comments and the direction that you've really provided for us. And we wish you well with your work at USAF. You're doing incredible work, and we know of that work. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yes, talking the state of higher learning in South Africa and around the world with Professor Ahmed Bawa of the USAF, University South Africa, that is the body that oversees and works with 26 universities and institutes of higher learning in South Africa. And we are talking the pulse of higher education, taking the pulse of higher education in South Africa and worldwide. In the studio with me this evening is the Rev Dr Rudi Buys, the Executive Dean at Cornerstone Institute, and we were talking earlier on learning about an overview of the state of things at this point from Professor Ahmed Bawa, the CEO of the USAF, Universities South Africa. Joining us on the line now is Professor Loretta Feris, who used to be the Vice Chancellor at UCT until recently, and she is going to be in the hot seat with Dr. Rudi Bass asking the questions. Professor Feris, are you there?
Hi, good evening. Hi, Ryan. Hi, Rudy. It's so lovely to join you this evening. I have to congratulate you on this collaboration. I think it's a wonderful idea.
Thank you very much, Loretta, and it's wonderful to hear your voices. Well, just for the listeners, I've had the privilege of working with Professor Feris for a bit, and she might not say so, but she's been a key role player in much of the project for significant change at UCT, and we want to thank you for that work, Loretta. We're aware of that work, and we appreciate that work, and we'll honor that work as we continue. Later, just for the listeners.
Thank you, Rudy.
Yeah, for the listeners' sake, you've returned to your first love, if I may, as a professor of law. Just share with the listeners what's your particular interest, your field of interest. What are you focusing your scholarship on in law at this point?
So yes, Rudy, I've been a law professor really for the bulk of my life, and then I've have been briefly in higher education management, and I'm now back as an academic. My focus is environmental law, and I sort of work at this intersection between human rights and the environment. And so I look at a variety of issues. For example, right now I'm looking at indigenous knowledge systems. and ways in which it relates to the environment and ways in which we need to protect our indigenous knowledge systems, which is very much linked to the issue of decolonization that Professor Bawa talked about earlier on. You know, it's about knowing and understanding that our indigenous knowledge is actually a system of knowledge that is deeply ingrained in our cultures, across a variety of cultures in South Africa. And it comes with deep-seated competencies and wisdoms about nature, about ways of living, ways of being. And I've looked for many years at how do we protect those forms of knowledge from a legal point of view. But I'm also looking now more specifically at how can those systems inform. For example, how can it inform climate change?
Right.
For example, how can traditional medicines inform current health practice?
Yeah, and it's a major debate, I would argue, you know, for all institutions, not only, you know, in the broad generic sense of, if you will, a decolonization project, but the very real lived experience of students and academics as part of an institution. So in a sense, I'm very thankful that you bring up the notion of decolonization and how that relates to the Knowledge Project, because that's one of the things I wanted to sort of ask you about as we're reflecting on higher education, not only over the past few years, but also to the future, and how we but how we intend to rethink higher education in the country. What do you think would be the main areas of work that one would work with? I mean, you led transformation at your institution in a major way. And to a large extent, also the teaching and learning shifts that I know must take place at all institutions. But you know, within that context, apart from the knowledge work that would happen within a faculty, what would be the other areas of decolonization? Our UCT has been in the news, of course, with the Rose Must Fall movement, and then the fees must fall, and it played a leadership role on a national level in that regard. But outside of, or in addition, or next to, or in conjunction with those symbolic battles, if you will, with the remnants, if you will, of decolonized knowledge systems, what would you advise institutions to focus on in the broad transformation project?
Yeah, you know, I think, first of all, that we shouldn't see transformation as something separate, something distinct to the core areas of focus for any university or any institution of higher learning, which is in essence teaching and research. And we should really see transformation as integrated into our research projects, our teaching projects. And so decolonization, for example, is part of that. You know, we have to think very deeply about what we teach, of course, our curriculum, our course design, but we also need to think about who teaches. You know, and with who teaches, I'm not actually only talking about, you know, is it the white professor or the black professor? I'm also thinking that we should actually bring the auntie from the flats into our classroom, you know. We should see people around us as people with competencies. You know, they may not have an education, but they may have competencies that will enhance our classrooms. I have
goosebumps, you know. But you're very exciting. I'm not interrupting. I'm just saying I'm yes, riot.
Professor Feris, yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I mean, imagine the auntie from the flats coming to teach in Afrikaans, which at this point is still a contested language, it seems, whether it's indigenous or not. It's very interesting for me because a few years ago I attended a talk by Mahmoud Mamdani, where he basically surprised everyone, even the sort of fees must fall students who were at the campus. I don't know if you were there at that talk, where he basically said that Afrikaans was the biggest process of decolonization in the history of South Africa. The way that the Afrikaners formalized Afrikaans and separated it from Dutch and all of that. And it doesn't seem that message has gotten through to the higher authorities.
No, well, I mean, that's a very interesting and actually different debate about Afrikaans. But let's take that example. I'm from the Northern Cape originally, and I would love for my students to actually hear from one of the. I've recently been interviewing women in the Makwaland who have been practicing as midwives all of their lives. And I would love for the 94-year-old Aunt Katrina to come and talk to my students and actually speak to the second curriculum, right, that Professor Bawa and Rudy talked about. So I would want Aunt Katrina to come and talk in Afrikaans to students who may not ever have learned Afrikaans, but to hear this black woman speak Afrikaans, it's the way she's grown up, it's the language in which she dreams, it's the language in which she practices as a midwife, and she speaks it so beautifully. And to speak about her experience and to speak about her resilience as a human being, and her ability to have trained herself the skill, which she has learned from her grandmother, and which she has not just it's a skill she's learned, but it's also a skill that she has adapted over time. Having learned and taught herself. It's actually quite amazing. I'm very excited about this idea of indigenous knowledge systems and how underutilized it is.
I, in a sense, Ryan, thank you for raising sort of language, because, we know that sort of language would be the medium that we swim in, in the Knowledge Project broadly. What I really find interesting is to ask the question to what extent the way that universities, higher education institutions deal with language and languages, both as modes of instruction, what language we use to teach and learn, but also the language that's, in the corridors and on campus and on the sport field and how free that space in actual fact would be. The idea would be that how institutions deal with that in actual fact facilitates access for the for the auntie from a local community to come and teach on campus, and whether there's really space for that. What would you say, Professor, in terms of how institutions increasingly seem to go for sort of English as an international access point, especially as we enter the virtual world much more so due to COVID? Is it an unrealistic expectation to think that different language communities would gain equal access to higher education?
I think there are different ways in which we can actually have diversity and inclusion when it comes to languages. I think when you talk about the fact that increasingly we have English as kind of the language that opens up access, I think that makes it very difficult to argue for, say, for example, an Afrikaans-only institution or even a Xhosa-only institution. But I don't think that necessarily closes the door for all our other languages. So what we, for example, done at UCT over the last few years is in our residences. So part of what under my portfolio was student affairs, so I was responsible for residences and also for the academic life within residences. And what we've done is we have set up tutorial groups in residences, but mother tongue tutorial groups. So we would, for example, have a math tutor that tutors math in Zulu, and Zulu-speaking students could access that. So, that's just one example of doing it. Another example is many institutions are now saying, if you want to write your PhD dissertation, for example, in your native language, so you may have gone through your undergraduate degrees in English, but you now want to write your PhD in isiXhosa. You can do so. If you have a supervisor and if you can have external examiners that can examine that thesis, then you're free to do so. So we're beginning to find ways to open up the access for our different languages to almost kind of relive its academic relevance. And in doing so, I think we may be able to bring some of these languages, Afrikaans, Zulu, Xhosa, back into academia, whilst English may still be the kind of dominant language. But it doesn't mean that other languages have to die as an academic language. And can I just maybe add one third example, is that in a number of faculties and at UCT, we started a process of actually having multilingual dictionaries of terms. So you would have, for example, have in the science faculty, you would have a dictionary of the terms that are used predominantly in science in other languages, such as Xhosa, for example.
And what is exciting about that is that in actual fact, if you open the design process of solutions for access, to more than only some offices or some desks or some stakeholders, you actually find this wealth of ideas that makes it possible to have those changes affected and to have people access. What I appreciate in what you're saying is that much of how I hear you talk about this tells me about an increasing drive at our institutions to be closer to the people, if I could sort of put it in that language, to be much more engaged with the real life of where students and lecturers also, but to a large extent where students actually live, where they actually come from, what their daily lives look like. And so one question that comes to mind when you think about the lived experience of students at this point is whether we will see a shift in what the student movement would demand, would push the sector to. What were the type of issues and questions that the student movement will now raise in higher education, now that we live in this COVID world, if you will, now that we've come to the struggle of what COVID presents our communities with? So in a sense, one would say, how would the student movement's engagement change, because the actual lived experience of our students might well have changed dramatically due to the pandemic and all its impact, unemployment, greater inequality, all those type of issues that results from a pandemic such as this. How do you think would the student movement possibly change in its engagement for where things are at?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting to watch the student movement trying to almost adapt to this new reality, right? So I mean, I've lived through the student protest of the last 6-7 years, and it was interesting during the lockdown. There was an attempt last year by the students to have a protest. And all of a sudden, there was nothing to shut down. The classes, classrooms were empty. So at one point, students occupied a building and they said, we will not be moved. And we were, as management, we were thinking, well, it's okay. we don't need you to move because we're not using the building. And I think they soon realized, we will have to rethink different ways of activating students, of getting students involved in because protest in a way. I mean, I'm probably going to make a very controversial statement here, but I think in the life of a student, in the life of a young person, the notion of activism, I think, is actually quite an important one. I mean, it's not great when you're sort of facing the student protest, but I think it's actually good for students to be activists. I don't think violent protest is a good thing, but I think activism is an important part of a democracy.
Yeah,
and so I think that the issues will largely remain the same, Rudy. I think the issues of inequality will remain the same, but it is the challenge of getting students to actually rise up, to participate, and students may actually also go more virtual, in their attempts to engage students.
Isn't only the rich students who have access to resources that really will gain the benefit in the virtual world of learning and teaching?
I think that's still our greatest challenge, not just in South Africa, but I think across the world, is the kind of digital equity gap, if one can call it that. Because we've seen that it is indeed the students, not just the students, but also the universities, as Professor Bawa has said, whose pockets are not that deep, who really struggle to get students to be able to have digital online learning or emergency remote learning because they didn't have access to devices or access to data. And as a university with a deeper pocket, which is UCT, we were able to provide students with devices and with data. But even where we provided those devices, students often their personal circumstances were such that they were not able to learn because they live in a household where there are 7 other people living in a two room shack, for example, or they live in a really remote rural area where there is no electricity. So we really have come to understand that in order for students to really benefit from digital learning, they actually have to be resident at the university. And so we started returning students to the campus as much as we could under the lockdown levels and as much as it allowed us to. And I think we're now at a point where I think going forward, there will be more of a hybrid system, as Professor Bawa has said. But I think a fundamental element of that will have to be that we have students resident at universities in order to benefit from that kind of digital learning.
It's an interesting debate, if you will, around remote learning, all the multimodal, the mix of virtual and face-to-face. And it's the debate around, which provides greater access. When you go online, just sort of to oversimplify, if you will, some of our students won't be able to access, teaching and learning as fully as others would be able to due to sort of access to resources or not. When we talk about sort of on-campus residency, we don't have sufficient residences in the country to actually host the number of students that we have within the system. And so whichever way you actually develop and respond to the current realities, there's compromises to be made continuously. What do we do in a sector with those compromises? Compromises that might well be the mediator of continuous conflict, and not only by protest to the student movement, but, through various political structures, if you will, through state mechanisms, sector sort of engagement. But, with those compromises, in a sense, that seems to be a reality for the foreseeable future. What do we do with that? How do we, one could say that's an indicator of how deep change, in actual fact, is affecting the sector, and which is a high time, if you would say so. But still, is that something that we able to sustain? We'll be able to, continue with the deep knowledge projects that we want to for our continent, with this type of struggle that we're in. What do we do with this? I know it's a broad question, but what would you comment on that difficulty that we face in our country?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's a difficult of finances, right? It's a difficult of funding that you're alluding to. And I think that operates at two levels. On the one hand, it's the affordability of higher education, and we know that students have been struggling around this issue for a number of years. And we had a little bit of a moment in 2017 where NSFAS expanded and more students were funded. But NSFAS is clawing back on that. It has already dropped quite a number of programs that will no longer be funded by NSFAS. So that is also going away. And then the second problem is that universities themselves, the public universities in particular, that their funding is increasingly being cut. And so in a moment where there is this opportunity to actually move forward from what we have seen in the pandemic, the ability to actually have a take-up of digital learning and an online learning platform, we actually don't have the money to invest sufficiently in that. And so I think it does provide a moment of crisis, but perhaps also a moment of innovation for us. I like the idea that Professor Bawa has mentioned, and I'm sure when Martin Oosthuizen comes on later, he will actually say to you that all three of those ideas that Professor Bawa put on the table are ideas that's already taken up by CHEC. That the four institutions of which UCT is part of CHEC has already, we have shared services in our libraries. We have not a degree, but we have a diploma across three of the universities. We've been aggregating our resources. So it is very much possible, and as a sector, I think we're going to have to look at that. In addition, I really think that private sector should come to the party in ways that it actually used to in the past. Rudy, we had, I think, many more scholarships, that was funded by companies, by mining companies, for example, by financial companies, financial institutions. I think that these kinds of institutions will have to come to the party, and we should look at public-private partnerships. And I know that there's some people will say, well, already we have sort of this drive towards capitalism, and it's not good for public education. But I think the reality is that we're going to have to involve private companies in the public education sector much more aggressively.
Do you think there's, or to what extent do you think there's opportunity for us, at least say in SADC or continentally, but, what possibilities do you think there might be, would you sense there would be in international collaborations, in the same way that you would aggregate resources across various institutions? Is it possible? I mean, it's just off the cuff an idea that sort of come up is within SADC. I mean, there would be both public and private institutions across this sort of a SADC countries and the region that would be able to share. Has that been explored? Those options that you're aware of, or I'm sure there must be some technical group that already investigates the options. But what are the real potential if we explore that direction for solutions?
I think there's some real opportunities, and especially in the context of digital learning, there's I don't think we've really looked into those kinds of partnerships sufficiently. On the research side, we have wonderful collaborations across the continent. I'm not just talking about Southern Africa, but I'm actually talking about continent-wide. But I think when it comes to teaching and learning, that is still an area that remains underexplored. There's some collaboration in the postgraduate sector, but when it comes to undergraduate teaching, we've done very little. I know that University of Pretoria, University of the Western Cape, they have some wonderful collaborations across the continent, but they really kind of the exception rather than the rule. So I mean, I'm not answering very specifically, but I agree with you. I think that is an area that we can probably explore in much more detail.
No, I really think sort of, the thought you share is I find, precise in terms of what, avenues it seems the sector already has available to leverage for international, support and resources and sharing and so. But the point I think is well made, that we're not, it seems to me that we're not yet considering our problems to find solutions also necessarily, with others across the continent. We might think there's lessons to learn, from Kenya or Ghana or Egypt or wherever it might be. But we've seeming not yet developed those partnerships strong enough to have a combined solution. Anyways, I suppose, Professor, that when COVID is real, and all the sort of known problems that we struggle with in the sector suddenly are much more prominent, inevitably we'll have to find those solutions and look for different partners. What would be your thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree. I think we actually undervalue, as South Africans, the fact that we are part of a continent that is, in essence, a young continent. It's a continent with immense opportunity. In a few years' time, let's say in a few decades' time, the continents such as Europe, for example, even North America to some extent, they're going to struggle with the aging population. And here we are with a young population in Africa that if we really begin to think of education as a way to actually catapult the continent, we in South Africa are uniquely situated because we have the resources. And I think we can take the lead in going into other countries on our continent and beginning to look at innovation that's already happening and actually use our resources to kind of leverage that and to take it further. So I definitely think that remains an area that is ripe with potential.
The Cornerstone Critical Dialogues, the second episode, we are talking about higher education in South Africa and worldwide. We've had some very in-depth discussion earlier on with Professor Ahmed Bawa of USAF and just now with Professor Loretta Feris, who is still on the line with us for a little bit, and we're just going to close off with Rudy.
Professor, thank you very much again for participating. As I listen to you, I can't help but ask myself, if I had to ask you to inspire me as a worker in higher education, as someone who has the privilege of engaging on sort of attempts at knowledge and all sort of the flaws of that and all the excitement of that and all those things. How would you inspire me at this time? I mean, we really face challenges. Our students face dramatic challenges. I'm a great teacher in class, but if you have to have me teach on online and virtual, suddenly I struggle. And my students get angry at me, I mean, these real struggles that I live with as for argument's sake, as a lecturer and as a student. How do I push through this time and adapt and adjust to this new environment? How would you inspire me to continue at this time? What would you say?
Well, thanks for that question. Over the last few years, I've worked with students quite closely. I mean, as a lecturer, you have students in your class, but in my capacity as the Deputy Vice Chancellor responsible for student affairs, I had to work with student leaders, and they have inspired me immensely. I've worked with them in different capacity, as the SRC or in various faculties, the faculty leadership, in the residences, the residence leadership, and in sporting, in the different sporting codes. I sat on the sport council with the students. And I will say to you that the future of this country is in good hands. Our students are absolutely amazing. They are competent, they are innovative, they are entrepreneurial, including social entrepreneurship. They really care about society, about social engagement. And these are our future leaders. And yes, they are struggling. We are all struggling. Many students actually say, we need technology, we love technology, but we also want to engage with our lecturers and we want to engage face-to-face. So that for me is also wonderful, because it means that even though this is a generation that, we often complain that they are too, connected to their devices, they actually are now saying, and this is what a survey shows, that they are saying we want engagement, we want to see people, we want to be with people, with our fellow students and with our lecturers. And so, I think we have, and that's maybe my final thought, is that if we think of our students as the future leaders of this country, I have worked with really amazing students. I feel very assured, that we are educating a core group of excellent leaders in various areas. I hope some of them will go into politics because I think our politics needs some good leadership, but certainly in other areas, in the different professions that they will be ending up in.
Well, that really inspires me. It says all we need, we already have. It's about, really focusing on how brilliant our students are and what they bring to the table as a new generation. What strikes me in what you say is the relationships, our people is what's rich about our country. So I think, was it Steve Biko who's well quoted to have said that Africa will give the world a more human face. And I hear that in what you're saying, and thank you for that word of inspiration. Professor, we wish you well with your work. It's brilliant to talk to you. Thank you for your time. Ryan, I think.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for being on the show. That was, we could be sitting here for hours just talking and lollygagging and going on. But I think it's fantastic that you gave us those insights, and we look forward to possibly speaking to you on another occasion in future around certain other topics of which you are a specialist in. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Right now, we're crossing to Professor Martin Oosthuizen. Professor, can you hear me? Are you there, Professor?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, sorry. Yes, it's all my fault in the studio. I'm still getting the hang of everything over here, but
okay.
Yeah, we have you now. So you've been listening to the conversation we've been having so far, I believe?
I have. Yes. Very, very interesting conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Bass now. He'll take it from here.
Hello, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful to have you in the conversation, and thank you for agreeing to participate and then spending the time listening through the whole program.
Yes, fine. Good evening, Rudy.
I wanted to ask you to give us an introduction to the Consortium and what it does in support of institutions in the province.
The Cape Higher Education Consortium is a consortium of the 4 public universities in the Western Cape. That's UCT, University of Western Cape, the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and Stellenbosch University. It has been around now for 27 years, so it has a very long history of promoting partnerships and collaboration between the 4 public universities in the Western Cape. And it had its origins really, in the mid-1990s with the dawning of democracy and the realization that universities need to work together to develop a new higher education system, and that there was a lot of value in collaboration. Originally, there was a very strong focus on what Ahmed was talking about earlier on, about shared resources, shared library systems, and so on. And then over the past 15 years or so, there's been a much stronger focus on partnerships with the Western Cape government, with the City of Cape Town, to work together to create or to develop the Western Cape as a learning region and a learning province. So I would say that currently a large focus of CHEC's work is on facilitating the collaboration between the 4 public universities in the Western Cape and the public sector in the region. We're also starting to focus a little bit more on the way that universities should work together with the private sector to collaborate and to work towards a shared future. And then the other thing that we do at CHEC is to think about higher education innovation and innovative ways to plan for future trends in higher education. Currently, we have a project funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, which is on a topic that's been talked about, especially by Loretta, around decoloniality, the ways in which universities understand themselves, define themselves in South Africa, and also looking at the issue of the curriculum. And the other project that we're working on with quite a substantial grant from the National Department of Higher Education and Training is a project on dual higher education, which is a system that is practiced quite commonly in certain parts of Europe, like Germany and Austria, but which really introduces an innovative curriculum model, which is based on a much stronger, closer partnership between industry and the business sector and universities, and where students actually spend time. They rotate in a systematic way between the university and the business setting, and the industry and employers are involved much more closely in the development of the curriculum and in thinking through what kinds of competencies and skills students need to learn, to develop, and the university colleagues and colleagues from industry engage in a more frequent discussion about the competencies, the attributes that students need to develop. So that I think is a very interesting project. We're working very closely in that project with the Western Cape government, City of Cape Town. They're on our advisory committees for that project. We don't presuppose that project will necessarily work in South Africa in the same way that it's working in Germany or Austria, but we do think that there is a definite need to think in innovative ways about how universities and employers can work together so that students can be better prepared for the working environment that they will be entering into after they graduate. So that's sort of, I think, sort of in a nutshell, what CHEC is trying to do. It's actually interesting.
In a nutshell, Professor, that's quite a mouthful rather than a nutshell,
Okay, sure.
So it's wonderful to hear how much work is in actual fact being done already on the sort of key parts of collaborative work as a solution for where we're at. It's really exciting to hear that. Quite incidentally, Bush Radio, which is a partner in this project, but I was actually started in 1992, Ryan, if I have it correct. Which means in actual fact the consortium and Bush might be celebrating the next, the 30-year anniversary together soon, So, Professor, but no, thank you very much for that. I mean, I can't help but ask myself, or tell myself that you would be expertly positioned to give us a sense of how it's going with the institutions in the province. What is the sector like? Clearly from what you're saying, there's vibrant collaboration, and so. But how's it going? What's happening with our institutions?
Well, I have to say that I don't stand at the coalface in the universities, but I think that my impression is that the Western Cape is really very privileged to have 4 strong and capable higher education institutions. We have universities in the Western Cape that are leading global universities. If you look at global ranking systems, we have leading global universities that are leading universities on the African continent. I would say that in general our universities are in very good hands. I mean, Loretta was speaking about the caliber of our students, and I think that one also has to acknowledge the caliber of our university leadership and management. So obviously all our universities have challenges, and they have challenges that are tied to their histories. You were talking at the start, Rudy, about narratives that universities tell about each other. Each university has its own particular trajectory, its own history, and it has to, negotiate that and decide, how it wants to build on that tradition. But I don't want to sort of lift any particular university out, but I think it's the journey of that, for instance, a university like the University of the Western Cape has engaged in, the way that it has really shed the kind of role that it was supposed to play, under the apartheid regime, and has really reimagined itself and repositioned itself, is actually quite phenomenal. And I think that we sort of have to acknowledge the way in which our universities have faced very very specific challenges. We talked earlier about inequities in the system, and I think that a university like the Western Cape, University of Western Cape, it still suffers from the legacy of unjust and inequitable past, but it's made tremendous strides. CPUT, I think, has had to deal with a very difficult merger between 2 former institutions, creating a new integrated culture. It's a large, complex university with multiple campuses. And I think it also deals with very complex issues in terms of expectations from its students. But again, I think it plays a leading role in providing very important educational opportunities for the students in our region and further afield. So I think that in general, it's the public higher education sector in the Western Cape is doing well.
What strikes me as you share, is to really get an understanding that our institutions are doing well together, but each of our institutions really has its own unique set of circumstances and contributions and offering. And even though there would be similar subjects and faculties and so, we have sort of a diversity of communities and institutions that make it, possible for all of us in our diversities and so forth to actually access our education. And that is really exciting. One can't sort of step away from that. So thank you for sharing that. Professor, I was just indicated that Ryan just let me know, but we have to actually finish up, in 3 or 4 minutes, and I feel like I owe an apology because you're sharing so much rich information. But if I could sort of hop along and just ask you specifically regarding what you think would be the most, not prominent, but the most urgent questions that we should be asking ourselves in higher education at this point, considering all the challenges that we face in any case prior to the pandemic, but all the implications of the pandemic, not only sort of methodologically or technically or so, but also sort of epistemologically, the deep shifts in the world and the context that we engage in higher education. Considering all of that, what would you sort of indicate as the most urgent questions, if you will, or problems that we need to unpack and work with?
I'll try to be very brief. Firstly, I think the future. Let's talk about the future world of work. But if I talk about the future world of work, I think that as a society we face tremendous challenges which we really don't have the answers to. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, the kind of things that we can do with new technological capabilities, huge ethical questions that we're going to have to answer. And we're going to have to come together in transdisciplinary and in interdisciplinary teams and work at these challenges. We're going to have to, try to. We need to move away from the idea that what students come to university for is to get a lot of knowledge, because what they actually will be coming to university for is to know how to negotiate an extremely complex world which is embedded in extremely complex ethical issues, and they have to find their way there. So knowledge, they'll be able to find knowledge anywhere. Knowledge will be, but actually information will be ubiquitous. What they will need to be able to do is turn that information into useful knowledge. They will need to be people who can navigate their way through knowledge. That's got huge implications for the way that we think about assessment and that we sort of teach our students. So, the time of the sage on the stage is gone.
The sage on the stage has left.
But
Brilliant, Professor.
But the time of the facilitator of knowledge, the person who does what Ahmed was talking about, who engages with students in smaller, intensive learning environments and teaches them to think critically, to know how to analyze problems. Those are the kind of issues that we're going to need, sort of, and qualities that we're going to need to instill in our students. To be flexible. People are going to have multiple careers. A big question going forward is how important is it still to have a formal degree of 3 or 4 or 5 years? What about micro-credentialing? What about the fact that you learn on the go? Now,
thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. We're going to speak to you another time, I'm sure. Definitely. There's so much to talk about in this space.
You're most welcome.
Have a good evening, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, bye.
That was Professor Martin Oosthuizen of CHEC, CEO of CHEC, Executive Director, and he was giving us a look into the future of higher education, where the sector is going, what we can expect to happen in the future. That was us in conversation with Professor Ahmed Bawa earlier on, Professor Loretta Feris after that, and now Professor Martin Oosthuizen. With Rudy, Bass of the Cornerstone Institute, Executive Dean, thank you so much for your facilitation, for all those questions. We're going to have to leave it there. Hope to see you next week, right here.
This podcast is proudly brought to you by Cornerstone. Learn to change the world.